Welcome to the Coffee with Father Barry podcast. In each episode, we'll chat with Father Barry Fisher about his 50 years spent serving the Lord as a missionary priest of the precious blood. Christ's call took him around the globe, from the United States to Latin America, to Rome, Austria, and beyond. Father Barry hopes that through sharing his stories, you too will be inspired to reflect on your own unique faith journey. Welcome to today's episode of Coffee with Father Barry. I am your guide, Sarah Getman, and we are, of course, with Father Barry Fisher today as he talks a little bit about the political situation in Chile. So, Father Barry, your previous podcast, we spoke about your arrival in Chile in March of 1970. That year was really politically charged, as it was the year of presidential election. What do you recall about that year?
So when I arrived in Chile, I found myself in a very contentious presidential election campaign. There were three candidates representing like the three major political tendencies in the country. There were three candidates then. The major in the electorate, Jorge Alessandri, was a candidate of the right, the son of a previous president. Radomiro Tomic was the standard bearer of the centrist Christian Democratic Party, and Salvador Allende, a senator who led a coalition of the left called Unidad Popular. Salvador Allende had been a presidential campaign candidate in various opportunities before, but had never been elected. This time, however, he stood a good chance. The campaign was hard fought by all sides, and the country became more and more polarized. Marches, campaign rallies, propaganda ruled the day. It was something I never experienced before, except for that one time I went to a protest march in Chicago that I told you about in a previous, but this was a whole different ballgame. I don't think there was anyone who didn't take a stand with one or the other candidates. The church was technically neutral, although it was generally believed that they would stand with the Christian Democrats, which historically was sort of identified with the Catholic Church. Election day came September 4th, 1970, a date I'll always remember. Fortunately, it came off peacefully. There were no violence at all on that day. And Salvador Allende received about 36% of the popular vote, Alessandri 35%, and Tomic 28%. So since no one got a clear majority of the popular vote, it was thrown into Congress, which had to ratify it. And usually then just the two highest candidates with votes one of them would be selected. And weeks passed by and intervened, and there was a lot of tension in the country wondering, well, would they confirm Allende or not? And eventually, on October 24th, a month later, Congress did vote to respect the will of the people, indicating by their vote that Salvador Allende was legitimately elected to the country's presidency, and became the first democratically elected socialist president in the Western Hemisphere. It was indeed a historic day.
Yes, quite the historic moment. During all of this turmoil in the electoral year, you were still in the Pontifical Catholic University in Santiago. How did you experience the campaign within the Faculty of Theology in the university?
Well, the same divisions that were in the country, we also had within the theology students in the faculty. But mostly, we were represented two groups, those who were with the Christian Democrats, which was probably the majority, and those of us who stood with the candidacy of Salvador Allende, called the Frente Izquierda de Teología. I was part of that group that supported the candidacy of Salvador Allende, the leftist candidate. And I want to emphasize that leftist and socialist in those days in Chile did not mean Marxist socialism. it was more the brand of a European or Western European like Italy or Germany or France have socialism. But it is more the candidate, the party who stands more for the rights of the workers and the poor. So that was what attracted me to that candidacy. And there were many debates in the theology department about the relationship between Christianity and socialism. It were very interesting and for me very enlightening because it's a topic I had never treated before, was not aware of, but discovered that there were non-Marxist socialism that had a lot to do with Christianity, of living in defense of the poor and so forth. After the election and the confirmation of Allende, then, this polarization in the country grew even stronger.
How did the election of a socialist president affect the relationship of the church with the president?
Good question. The head of the church in Santiago was the most influential churchman in the country and very influential in Latin America, was Cardinal Raúl Silva Enriquez. He came from an aristocratic family himself, but was very compassionate. He had a heart for the poor. He sought dialogue with the president, and they had a pretty good relationship, actually. Allende I want to emphasize, he never restricted the activity of the church in any way. He wanted to impose socialism, but through the democratic process. He had been in Congress for many years, so he believed in democracy, but he also believed in socialism. And he came to power through democracy. There was only one time that I recall, and I remember when he wanted to propose for the country a reform of the educational system. And that is always a very key element of how do we educate our young people. Then the church at that moment protested strongly. They did not want him to touch education. And because of the relationship I think he had with the cardinal and the church, Allende backed down on that. He did not follow through on that proposal that he had. Meanwhile, the right began to flex their muscle, those who had lost the campaign, but they were usually the richer, the well-to-do people, influential in different positions in the country. Allende had nationalized the copper industry. Copper had been the major income for the country, and so that had a lot of people very upset. Suddenly, food shortages began to appear. The shelves in supermarkets began to become empty, and basic products were lacking for the people. This caused a lot of unrest. I remember very well how people had to wait in line for hours to be able to try to be present when a store opened, to be the first ones to buy what little products were there. In our own neighborhood, we had some small shops, and whenever it was said, tomorrow sugar is going to be sold in this shop, people would actually sometimes go out and sleep overnight on the street in order to get in line to be able to get maybe a pound of sugar or a pack of noodles or pasta. And if they were lucky, maybe even a chicken or a piece of meat. So you can imagine how this became very conflicted for the country. And at the same time, it was always rumored that those shortages were created by the right, those who had the money and had the ownership of a lot of these companies that produced. Now, to combat this food shortage, the government instituted a program, if I recall the name properly, was HOP, which distributed coupons to those who would inscribe in this program to get a basic basket of elements, staples, like oil, sugar, rice, meat, coffee, and so forth for family. So I inscribed in that program, and each month I would go on a designated date to the supermarket and be given one of these packages of food. So at least we were assured a basic content for the month. At the same time, hyperinflation, it was just skyrocketed, and that produced a black market. That at one point you could exchange $1, for example, on the black market and get 5 times what you would get if you changed it in a money exchange house or with the bank. So this caused more tension with Father Bernie, with whom I lived. Because when we came to live together, we agreed that we would split all the costs equally. Okay? So he was on the black market. He was getting 5 times the value of what I got for my dollar. And yet he would buy and go out and purchase like a toaster without even consulting me, and then hand me the bill and say, I want the half of this. So, yeah, that produced a little bit of tension among us, but I was always faithful to the government because I supported the Allende government. So I kept changing on. I never changed on the black market. I changed on in the bank or in a money exchange. While Bernie made money on it. In fact, he was even able to take a trip to Argentina and spend 5 days on the extra money that he got from the black market. So I was at a big disadvantage.
So with all of this going on, sounds a little bit high tension. What was your experience like? What can you tell us about your ordination and how you experienced polarization in the communities you were forming in the apartment complex?
So I was ordained on January 28th in 1973. Remember that in the Southern Hemisphere, that would be like our summer. So I was ordained on that date on the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas. It was the third year of the Allende government, and again, shortages were getting worse and worse. I remember very clearly that for my ordination party or banquet after my ordination, Father Don, the superior, could not find food to give us a meal or a grill party, whatever. The only thing he could find was some cheese, which then he had cut up in little cubes, potato chips, soft drink, and a little wine. That was what I had for my ordination banquet that day. I believe this left a very deep impression on me because when I was Superior General, we'll talk about that much later, when I was Superior General, I got to see many ordinations in different parts of the world. And frankly, sometimes I felt scandalized by the banquets that they put on and the rich vestments and gifts that our young men would receive. Remembering my own experience, and I thought, if I were to give a gift to a newly ordained priest, I think the best gift would be to give them a wash basin and a towel, along with a greeting card saying, so that you never forget what it's all about. In other words, it's not about the prestige, it's not about the position, it's not about, being apart from the people, but it's about service. There was one scary moment I experienced during this time of extreme polarization in Chile, getting back to the Christian community in which I was formed and ordained for. And by the way, I decided to be ordained in Chile, which was a tough decision because my family had waited 13 years for me to be ordained, and I wasn't going to be there for them at that time. So my father came, my sister came, and one friend. I had 3 of my personal guests for that ordination day. But I wanted to do it with the people because this is who I felt that they were my formators. I was formed by the people that I shared faith with and prayed with and studied the Bible with. So I was continuing to visit. I always visited, not just in the beginning, but throughout my time in Chile, I visited the families. I visited their homes. They would invite me for supper. Wherever I stopped, they would say, we can always add a little more water to the soup. Sit and have supper with us or have a dessert with us. And that was part of my activity in the beginning, was I was still getting to know the people. There was one family that I was visiting I remember that family well. I had gone there many times. At this particular day, the president of not Salvador Allende, but Fidel Castro was visiting from Cuba. And he was visiting in Santiago and giving a speech in the National Soccer Stadium, which was just across the street from where we were. And I remember him saying at that moment that he admired Salvador Allende, a fellow socialist, and what he was trying to do, impose a type of socialism through the democratic process. And I remember him saying very clearly, but Salvador, I must say, I don't think it's going to work. How are you going to bring about socialism by the very people in Congress who are against socialism? So democratically, he didn't think it was going to work. It would be a failure. And the fact is it did fail because months later, that same year, he was deposed from the presidency. But that night, as we were waiting, listening on TV to the discourse of Fidel Castro just nearby, I would usually be very quiet because I knew in that house they were not in favor of Allende. And the head of the house, or the lady of the house, Zulemita, began to talk about the cardinal. Because the right hated the cardinal. Literally, they really hated him because of his defense of the poor and so forth. And she said, I would like to see that man hung in the Plaza de Armas. Well, at that, I said, okay, I had enough. And I said, I'm sorry. Zulemita, he is our cardinal, and he at least deserves our respect, even if we might not agree with him. Well, at that, her son-in-law sprang up from his chair, a big man. He had been a bodyguard of a former rightist president, had a pistol in his waist, and he jumped up and he started shouting at me. He picked me up, opened the door, and literally pushed me out of the house physically, shouting at the top of his voice, "Get out of here, you cura comunista! You're cura, Tupamaru!" And he shouted the whole way down, and he said, "Never come back into this house again." And he shouted loudly, and it would just echo through the apartment complex, And I went tearing down those steps, and very concerned because people were really polarizing, crazy. And I thought, oh my God, I hope I don't get shot in the back as I was running down the steps. And fortunately, I was not. But that's how the political charge. And I could never go back again to that house. That was one experience I had at that time of my life. But I would have others, which you'll hear about in later podcasts.
Wow. Quite the experience. Thank you so much for sharing those stories with us. And of course, there are many more to tell, but that concludes our episode for today. We hope you'll join us again soon for Coffee with Father Barry.